won't hold that against him. And he's got a wonderful, wonderful presentation talking about Vietnam today. So let's give him a nice round of applause and welcome him to Trygve.
Thank you, sir. Jose does outrank me. I've had a lot more years on the planet than him now. This uniform has not been altered since it was fitted for me in 1990. But thank you to Jose, thank you to Robin Brekus and the Dakota Territory Air Museum for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you also to all who are participating or attending today's ceremony. And finally, thank you to our honored Vietnam veterans, both for your service to our country and for being here with us today. Where to begin with a speech about the Vietnam War is a question with nearly as many answers as when did the war begin? The first thing, and I know some of you are post-Cold War babies, so the majority of you are not, I can see that. But, and the first thing to remember is that the Vietnam War did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of the larger Cold War, and the dominant paradigm through which 5 successive United States presidents viewed the war was that of the Cold War and the domino effect, which held that if one nation were allowed to become communist, then its neighbors would follow one by one, like a line of falling dominoes. In looking for the start of the war, one could go all the way back to 1858, when the French colonized the area and called it French Indochina. Or to the end of World War II, when Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, but the French resumed colonial rule. Or 1949, when the fighting began in earnest, with the Chinese aiding the Viet Minh and the United States aiding the French. Or perhaps 1954, when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and the Geneva Accords divided the country in two at the 17th parallel. Or maybe 1955, when South Vietnam declared itself an independent Republic of Vietnam. Or the next year, when the U.S. began training the South Vietnamese forces. The litany of dates goes on and includes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, and Operation Rolling Thunder, and the arrival of the 9th Marine Corps Brigade in 1965. That's my personal pick. Once the Marines have landed, you have yourself a war. Of course, by that time, more than 400 U.S. servicemen had fallen in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, the number of Americans serving in country was over 185,000. Now, I'm an educator, so I know if I continue on as if this gathering were a history class, your eyes will all begin to glaze over like freshmen first period on a Monday morning, and you'll decide that you can look all this stuff up later, which is absolutely true. More important than when the war began or ended is what did it mean, and what can we learn from it? For me, it means that one of my earliest childhood memories is of watching the evening news and asking my father why we were fighting guerrillas in Vietnam. I was horrified at the idea of armed apes organized for combat. Years later, it meant that I joined a military led by Vietnam veterans who'd been hardened by combat against a tough and determined enemy. All of the tactics, techniques, and procedures I learned both as an infantry officer and as a helicopter pilot had been honed by lessons learned in the Vietnam War. One could argue that we've learned very little about heliborne operations or patrolling that the Vietnam War hadn't already taught us. When I attended briefings in Quantico, Virginia in the run-up to the 1991 Gulf War, predicted U.S. casualties were in the thousands. They ended up being less than 300. Those numbers had been based on an enemy equal to that which our Vietnam veterans had faced. Fortunately, that was not the case. For over 58,000 American servicemen and women, the Vietnam War meant the end of their lives. For their loved ones, it meant the end of hope for the safe return of the fallen and the life they had imagined for and with them. Over 77,000 veterans were permanently severely disabled in the Vietnam War. Eventually, more than 2.6 million Americans served in uniform in Vietnam. I won't claim to know what it means to those who return, because I know that it is probably different and carries more than one meaning for each of them. For our nation, the Vietnam War has meant many different things at different times. It has inspired books of memoir, history, and fiction, movies, ranging from Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter to Forrest Gump, and countless songs and other types of art. We as a nation learned, I believe, not to blame the soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine for the genesis or conduct of war. I hope we have learned to question our assumptions and to examine the paradigms through which we view international relations and the conduct of war. No one old enough to remember that time doesn't have some kind of opinion or belief about the war. There was even some disagreement when the winning design for the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. was unveiled. But the finished memorial is now a can't-miss attraction on the mall. It may be the most often touched of all the memorials. It is stark and powerful, and you can't stand among the 58,318 names carved in the stone and not feel something. The Vietnam War does or can mean something to each of you. Perhaps you haven't found it yet, and as an American, you're free to not make the effort. Thanks, in part, to those who have been willing to go in harm's way. To the Vietnam veterans in attendance, and to those 1,458 whose names are carved on the tri-state wall, thank you. You made me and my peers better war fighters, and you are a treasured subset of your generation, those who went.
Thank you very much, Major Hammer, for those wonderful words.